good evening, everybody. It's really great to have you here with us this evening. My name is Sarah Cooper. I'm a faculty investigator at HudsonAlpha, and we're really pleased to have you join our event tonight. It's going to be talking about genetic testing and health disparities as it relates to genetic testing and healthcare in general. So we're excited to have a great group with us here today. This event is in partnership with the Links Inc. organization of Greater Huntsville, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Sharon Butler, the president of the Links Inc. organization. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Cooper. Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening as we, Greater Huntsville chapter of the Links Incorporated, address healthcare concerns in our community. The Links Incorporated is an international, not-for-profit corporation that was established in 1946. It is one of the oldest and largest volunteer service organizations of extraordinary women who are committed to enriching, sustaining, and ensuring the culture and economic survival of African Americans and others of African ancestry. The Links Incorporated established the Health and Human Services facet in response to the chronic health disparities that persist in Black communities and result in a decreased life expectancy of African Americans. Our goal is to promote and facilitate programs that support the maintenance of good health and the elimination of chronic health disparities in communities of color through education, health advocacy, and optimal utilization of health resources. Community education about health risk is crucial, and we've partnered with HudsonAlpha and Kylos Genetics to provide this opportunity for our community. I am Sharon Butler, president of Greater Huntsville chapter of the Links Incorporated, and we welcome you.
Next, I'd like to turn it over to Daryl Ezell, the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at HudsonAlpha. He's going to be our moderator for this evening, so take it away, Daryl.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. Good evening. I'm Daryl Ezell, Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at HudsonAlpha. I will serve as your moderator for tonight's roundtable. Tonight, we will cover several topics related to genetic testing, health disparities, and matters around cancer. We will have a more in-depth conversation later on in the webinar. But first, let's welcome our guest. Please, let's go around and introduce ourselves. Dr. Cooper?
Hello, as I said, my name is Sarah Cooper. I'm a faculty investigator here at HudsonAlpha. My group at HudsonAlpha does research to understand how our genetics impacts our risk for cancer, and also how we can use genetic and genomic technologies to help treat cancer patients more effectively. Importantly, for this webinar, I also am leading the Information is Power initiative, which is an opportunity for genetic testing for cancer risk in North Alabama, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that as we move forward.
Thank you so much. Dr. Belinda Savage Edwards.
Good evening. I am Belinda Savage Edwards. I am a neurologist here in Huntsville, and I am a member of the Links. I serve as co-chair of the Health and Human Services facet. This is a passion of mine. I am the principal investigator of several ongoing trials in my practice. I'm a headache specialist. And so I am more than happy to be here this evening.
Thank you. Mrs. Veronica Grieve.
Hello, everyone. I am Veronica Grieve. I'm a certified genetic counselor with HudsonAlpha, and I work with the Information is Power project. So if you haven't heard of genetic counselors before, many people haven't, we end up kind of taking personal and family history information to determine risk, whether somebody's high risk or low risk for a genetic disease, talk to people about genetic testing options and the pros and cons.
Right. Thank you so much, Mrs. Rochelle Jordan Davis.
Good evening. I'm Rochelle Jordan Davis. I'm a diversity consultant and educator and former assistant dean for diversity at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. Most recently, I served as the co-chair for the HudsonAlpha Community Engagement and Diversity Council, where we were engaged with helping to bridge the gap in health research within the Huntsville community. I'm delighted to be here this evening.
Thank you. And President Sharon Butler.
Good evening. My name is Sharon Butler, and as I indicated before, I am the president of Greater Huntsville Chapter of the Links Incorporated. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll be hearing from our roundtable a little later on in the program. Back to you, Dr. Cooper.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got some slides to share with you all, and here goes. Let's hope that works flawlessly. All right, hopefully you see all of our pictures. I just want to welcome you again and thank all of the panelists who are here with us today. I also wanted to make a point right at the very beginning to acknowledge Dr. Debbie Redmond Hyder, who was also instrumental in organizing this event. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us tonight, but she, I know, is in great support of this event, and we are really thankful for her support and work in helping us organize and plan it. So thank you, Debbie, and we will look forward to seeing you soon. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how your genes influence your health and how that information can impact your experience in the healthcare system. So let's just jump right into it. So today I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about HudsonAlpha in general. So for those of you who may not know about us, we'll hear a little bit more about what HudsonAlpha is and what we do. We're going to talk about health disparities. Sharon gave a really great introduction about some of the challenges that our community and our country is facing as differences in care and barriers to healthcare exist in the African American community and other underrepresented communities. From there, we'll talk a little bit about where do we go from here, how HudsonAlpha's missions are working to make some changes in those areas, alleviate some of the barriers that we know exist to healthcare, and then talk about ways that you can understand your own health a little bit better through genetics.
Dr. Cooper, I don't want to, the screen is blank at this time.
Oh no, that's sad.
No problem. There we go.
So do you see a whole bunch of stuff now though?
We got it, today's program.
Okay, it's working. Okay then, well, we'll do it this way then. All right, so giving you a little bit of background about HudsonAlpha. HudsonAlpha is a nonprofit institute that was founded by Jim Hudson and Lonnie McMillan in 2008 when we opened our doors. And their vision for HudsonAlpha was to use genomic technology very generally to make the world a better place. So what does that mean? HudsonAlpha has several mission areas. One of the sort of foundational mission areas for HudsonAlpha is research. So I'm not going to read everything on this slide, but I think the important message is that there is research going on at HudsonAlpha in a variety of areas. Some of this research is very clinically oriented. So we're going to talk today a lot about cancer. We also have projects that are focused on neurological diseases. So what are some of the genetic changes that could make you more susceptible to neurological disease, or how do things in our genes and genomes impact how diseases affect us? Why are some people affected more severely than others, for example? We also have a great agri-science community. We're not going to talk about that today, but I hope you'll have an opportunity to hear about that soon. How can we use genetic and genomic technology to not only improve human health, but sort of give us more understanding about how could plants be used for bioenergy and create a more sustainable world. We also have a great genomic health program and a computational biology and bioinformatics team that really support all of these efforts. One of the unique things about HudsonAlpha is that we also have an economic development mission. So you may be familiar with the idea of sort of doing clinical research or doing research about the basic sciences, But usually those are done sort of at universities. One of the really cool things about Hudson Alpha, and one of the reasons that I was drawn here, Hudson Alpha is not only home to those nonprofit research labs, but also shares space with over 40 life sciences companies. So we've already heard Kairos Genetics mentioned. Kairos is the genetic testing company that we partner with to offer our free and reduced cost genetic testing through Information is Power. Over the last year, they've also been involved in coronavirus testing. Some of the other companies that I think are interesting to mention are Aclinate, which is a company that we're also collaborating with to help diversify research and educate diverse communities about the research programs that might be available to them. Diatherix is another company that you may have heard of, because when the swine flu what happened that was, I think, 2010, Diatherix was one of the first companies to develop a diagnostic test for the H1N1 virus. And then other companies like Serena, they're actually a biochemistry company that uses certain chemicals to help deliver drugs better. And those are drugs to treat lots of different conditions. So these are just a few of the companies that are on our campus, but it makes it a really unique place because the researchers are doing some of the hard work to develop new ideas and find out more information. And some of these companies are spinning out of that research, or in some cases collaborating with the researchers to develop new products or tests that can be, pretty quickly translated to something that benefits the public. Another really important aspect of our missions at Hudson Alpha is our education program. So one of the things that's really important to us is sort of training the next generation of scientists. We want to do that at a variety of different levels. So we have programs that are internships for college students. We also work, and I say it's the royal we have Neil Lamb as our director of education outreach at Hudson Alpha. He leads a variety of these programs, and we as researchers actually engage with these programs too. So we have summer internships where we're having students in our labs. There's also a lot of field trips, not so much this year, but and we hope coming back soon to Hudson Alpha, where we get a chance to meet middle school and high school students and tell them about, interesting things about science, hopefully to teach them what we're doing, but also get them excited about it. There's some great programs for educating the public. Some of you may have participated in the Path Forward program that just happened a few weeks ago to learn about coronavirus and how it impacts our community. There's a lot of online resources as well. And then finally, there's also teacher training and resources for adults as well. So educating the general public, our Biotech 1 courses, and then our teacher training programs, GTech and GREAT. Overall, the education team has created resources for students that have gone out to all 50 states and over 20 countries, which I think is really cool, that we here in Alabama are making an impact really around the world. Our final mission is our genomic health or genomic medicine mission. An example of this is our work at the Smith Family Clinic. In the picture at the right here, you see Dr. Bick, and he's our medical geneticist on staff. The clinic sees a variety of patients who may have a genetic condition or a possible genetic diagnosis that they're looking for, and there's opportunities to talk with Dr. Bick and use genetic and genomic testing to hopefully identify the cause of their symptoms. So the genomic medicine mission is kind of expanding in a way as well, as we think about how do we take the new information that we're learning through research and other platforms to not just diagnose rare disease, but think about things like disease risk or other information like how people respond to drugs, for example, that might be of benefit to a broader audience, not just sort of rare disease patients. So normally at this point, I say Hudson Alpha is so great. It's an amazing place to be, which is all still true. Unfortunately, we can't have a lot of visitors right now with COVID, but we do have some virtual events still happening. So I hope you'll consider taking a peek at what's going on virtually right now. And before too long, I hope we can see you at Hudson Alpha in person. It's a great place to visit. So when our public tours reopen, I hope you'll consider coming to see us. Okay, so that's what Hudson Alpha is. We have a lot going on, as you can probably tell. And today, what I'd really like to focus on is how your DNA can impact your health. How can you specifically learn more about your DNA? We'll talk a little bit about genetic testing and how does it work. But before we dive into the science, I thought it was worth spending a little bit of time talking about some of the barriers to genetic testing. We know that particularly in African American communities, there has been a tendency to have fewer genetic tests offered, and also in many cases, some apprehension about participating in genetic testing and research. So I think it's worth talking a little bit about that before we dive into the science. And I, can explain more about what that really would look like if you decide you are interested in learning more. So as we discussed at the very beginning, there are significant health disparities in the African American community, of course, in Huntsville and around our country. Overall, African Americans have a higher risk of many common diseases like high blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke. Overall, African Americans are more likely to die from these diseases from pretty much all causes. So the little graph cartoon on the right shows that African Americans really at all ages have a higher rate of death from just about every cause at every age. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons for that, but you can probably imagine what some of them are. And I think over the last year in particular, COVID has shown a very bright light on this disparity, as African Americans have died at a higher rate and contracted the virus at a higher rate than individuals of European American descent. So I think this is a great time to be sort of thinking about it and talking about how do we start to, I shouldn't say start, because it's the attempts have been happening in a way to try to make it better, but it's a big challenge. And so we at Hudson Alpha are trying to be a part of the solution. And so that's sort of what we're going to talk a little bit more about. So as I mentioned, the causes of health disparities are maybe not going to be a surprise to many of us, but they are really pretty widely different. So there's differences in access to care. Some of these are along socioeconomic lines, but there are also other factors that come into play as well. We know that there are lower rates of healthcare coverage in the African American community, and there also is a significant level of medical mistrust in the African American community, which can lead to delays in diagnosis and treatment for diseases that might be treated earlier or diagnosed earlier in the absence of that medical mistrust. There's also, as I mentioned, differences in care. So it's not just access to care, but the level of care that individuals are receiving. So we know, particularly as it relates to genetic testing, that, for example, a woman who is diagnosed with breast cancer, by following the typical guidelines that physicians use, should be offered an opportunity for genetic testing to determine whether their breast cancer might be explained by a genetic or inherited change. And we know that African American women are less likely, about two times less likely to be offered that genetic testing than Caucasian women. So there are differences that shouldn't be there, but that need to be addressed. And then there are also some differences in genetic differences and risk differences. So for example, triple negative breast cancer, which is the most aggressive form of breast cancer, is actually more common in African American women than in women of European descent. And so since that cancer is most aggressive and is more difficult to treat, women that have that type of cancer tend to have worse prognosis. And that also contributes to the differences in outcomes for these women. So the reasons for medical mistrust, I just wanted to talk about this a little bit from the perspective of, from my perspective as a researcher. I certainly haven't lived this, but I want to sort of acknowledge the importance of some of the historical incidents and that contribute to the medical mistrust in the African American community. So we often hear about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments that took place over a long period, over 40 years almost, and really are common, especially in Alabama, but I think really throughout the country, a common event that people will point to and say, well, look at how poorly African Americans were treated. Why should I trust anybody that's doing research at all? And Henrietta Lacks was another example. Henrietta Lacks was a woman who had cancer, and when her tumors were removed, her cells were used to make a cell line, which ultimately went on to be used in medical research. And at the time of when this was done, her consent was not received. At that time, it was not required, but she was never informed of what was going on in order to give her consent for her cells to be grown. And her family didn't know until much later either. So I think these historical events certainly are an important part of that medical mistrust, but it continues to be reinforced by inequities in healthcare access and in some cases, negative experiences with healthcare providers that African Americans experience. And so we understand that that is an important part of, the thought process that some individuals might go through as they think through, well, should I participate in this program? Should I think about doing genetic testing? How do I know that this information is going to be used for good? I do want to mention that the past events that have taken advantage of and hurt African Americans have had consequences. Some of them have been in additional regulations. So, for example, the formation of the Office of Human Subjects Protection, and this requires approval for any research involving human subjects. We also have regulations that consider both equitable recruitment of women and minorities into all research that involves human subjects. But despite these regulations, and not surprisingly given the past, we see that African Americans are less likely to participate in research, largely probably because of this medical mistrust, but also sometimes because of elements of the study design that maybe haven't taken into account some of the challenges that, or not even challenges, just differences that individuals in the African American community might face in participating. So it's unfortunate that this is the case, because one of the things that we are seeing in the research is that when we don't have as much information from African Americans, and I'll use genetic research as an example, when we don't have African Americans participating in our research programs, not just HudsonAlpha, but around the country, around the world, we have less information. And so when we're doing research, it's harder to interpret some of the genetic differences that we see in African Americans, because we haven't been able to see enough differences and correlate them with disease risk, for example. And so while we fully understand the concerns in the African American community, we want to try to talk through what some of those concerns are and emphasize what some of the benefits of participating in research can be. And one of those is going to be, sort of a better understanding of biology and genetics that might be either specific to African Americans or could potentially be just something that would not be easy to figure out in a European population. We know, for example, that there's how your kidneys work. There's differences in certain individuals that are more common in African Americans. And so we really need to study and understand African American biology for those reasons. So that sort of leaves us with, well, we have a little bit of a conundrum, and what do we do now? So I think I mentioned that over the last year with COVID and the awareness of these disparities is growing, and there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done to address the disparities that have been around for a long time. some of that hard work is happening, and we hope that the conversation that we have tonight is part of that. We at Hudson Alpha have an education mission and a training mission, but we also want to listen to our African American community members and partner with them like we have here for this webinar to make sure that we're representing and talking about these issues in a way that can be productive and helpful for everybody. So along those lines, Hudson Alpha has been working to help improve access and engagement in our community among underserved groups. And we hope that even though the participation hasn't been what we would love it to be, we want to see representative participation from all groups in our community. But we hope that there, programs like this one and new opportunities to engage with our community will allow a benefit for everybody going forward. So with that, I am going to talk a little bit more about the science. I'm going to actually keep it pretty simple, hopefully. So feel free to put those questions in the chat if you have any. But I want to just talk about how your genes can impact your risk for disease, and in particular, we're going to use cancer as an example here. So DNA is just a set of chemicals that are in every cell in your body. It looks like a really long string, and there's 4 different chemicals that are all strung together, and I've represented them here by the 4 letters that we use as abbreviations: A, T, G, and Z. It's a really long string of letters, 3 billion bases, and the sequence of those letters, or the order of the letters, is sort of the blueprint for our cells. And most DNA between any 2 individuals is exactly the same. So 99.99% are the same. Any 2 of us will be nearly identical at most places in our in that long strand of DNA. But there are a few differences between individuals, and that's what makes us unique. That's what makes us who we are. Some of those differences might change our eye color or determine how tall we're likely to be. But some of those differences can also help determine whether we're likely to become sick or get a particular disease. So now, about 30 years ago, we first identified one of the key genes that is important for cancer risk. And Mary Claire King is the scientist who identified that gene. Her name, the gene's called BRCA1, and there are certain changes in our DNA that increase our risk for breast cancer. And she did that work. It was first published in 1990. By looking at families where breast cancer was being passed down from a grandmother to a mother to a daughter, and measuring the changes in their DNA compared to individuals that don't have breast cancer. And she was able to identify some of these important changes in a gene that we know now is one of the key risk factor genes for breast and ovarian cancer. The overall, about 5 to 10% of cancer risk is explained by mutations in a variety of different genes that are inherited from our parents. So this little cartoon shows that there's 2 copies of every gene from dad and 2 copies of every gene from mom. So when dad and mom have a baby, daughter, or son, that child might inherit a change. We call it a variant that might increase his or her risk for cancer. And so that's what we call hereditary cancer risk or inherited cancer risk. I mentioned the BRCA1 gene. That was the one that was identified by Mary Claire King. It increases your breast cancer risk pretty dramatically. So about 1 in 8 women in her lifetime will receive a breast cancer diagnosis. If you have certain changes in this BRCA1 gene, your breast cancer risk is around 70%, and your ovarian cancer risk is between 40 and 50%, which is obviously a significant increase. There have been a variety of celebrities that over the years have had announced that they have identified changes in their in these genes that impact their cancer risk. And fairly recently, I found this article. Beyonce's dad had announced that he had a mutation in this gene, BRCA2, which also increases your breast and ovarian cancer risk. And there was actually an op-ed in the New York Times about how and whether individuals should or could be tested for this gene. So that's just one example of an inherited cancer risk gene for breast and ovarian cancer. We also know genes that are important for our colon cancer risk. These are just a couple of examples, but similarly, overall, about 4 to 5% of individuals will have colon cancer in their lifetimes. But if you have changes in certain genes, your colon cancer risk can increase pretty dramatically by about 8 to 10-fold. Now, that's all great to know, but how can it actually improve your health? And so that's where genetic testing comes in. If we know that there are certain changes in your DNA that impact your cancer risk, then we can actually measure or sequence those particular places in your DNA and determine whether you have a high risk for one of these cancer risk genes. So why would you want to do that? So genetic testing can complement your family history information. Sometimes you don't have very much information about parts of your family. You may know one side of your family better than others. Sometimes for cancers like breast cancer, you may not know much about your dad's side of the family, or maybe you don't have very many female relatives on that side, so it's hard to say what kind of risk you have. Genetic testing also is important for determining your risk strategy. So if you have a high risk change in one of these genes, then you might start screening earlier. And there's additional screening and better screening that can lead to earlier diagnosis. And we know that earlier diagnosis of cancer is universally associated with better outcomes for patients. And some cancers can even be prevented with prophylactic surgeries if you know you're at high risk. And finally, if you do find out that you have a known high risk change in your genes that are important for cancer risk, you can share that information with your family members who might also be at risk, and hopefully give them information that could impact their health as well. So with that, I sort of want to just summarize that we think that there's a lot of opportunity to use information from your genes to impact your health. We know that when it comes to inherited cancer risk, about 3% of the population carries a high risk variant or change in their DNA that would potentially impact how they might do screening. So it's not a huge fraction of the population, but for those that do have a high risk variant, it's useful information and can really be life-saving information. So with that, I want to give a little teaser for the second part of our event, our part 2 of this webinar, which will be April 6th, 2 weeks from tonight at 6:30. We're going to be talking about our Information is Power program, which offers free and reduced cost genetic testing to determine cancer risk. So we'll talk all about the details of how that test works. If you want to find out more right now, you can hop over to the Information is Power website at informationispower.org. And we're happy to say that through our partnership with Links and also philanthropic efforts here at HudsonAlpha, all the registrants for today's program will receive an offer for a free test. So with that, I think we are going to turn it back to Daryl to kick off some of our questions.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. Excellent presentation. At this time, I would like to, for us to open up a discussion, have a conversation, and unpack some of the points covered in Dr. Cooper's presentation about the impact of cancer with minorities, genetic testing, and health disparities. I want to start with first with Mrs. Jordan Davis. Why do African Americans and other minority groups share distrust and hesitancy towards the U.S. medical community?
As Dr. Cooper previously stated, she mentioned the Tuskegee experiment, as well as the testing done with Henrietta Lacks. So that was the beginning of the mistrust in our community. Also, the lack of opportunity and access, the barriers that are given to African Americans when they try to access healthcare. Oftentimes, their symptoms are dismissed, are not taken seriously. Sometimes, when they talk about pain, the threshold of pain is not taken as serious as their non-African American counterparts. And we also have implicit bias within the healthcare system. So oftentimes, when African Americans go into the healthcare system, when they talk about what's going on with them, their family history, oftentimes it might be discounted. Oftentimes, because they don't know as much about their family history, they might not be included in studies. But African Americans must now know that we have to be actively involved in our healthcare. We have to ask those questions that need to be answered. And if we don't participate in these studies, some of the drugs that they are now testing may not be effective on us as a race. So we really need to pay attention to what's going on with medical research. We need to be active participants, and we need to move away from thinking that things will not work in our favor. I also want to say, as an educator, we have many African American historically Black colleges who service medical students. Howard, Meharry, and Morehouse School of Medicine. And they are now taking active roles in research as it relates to African Americans. And I would encourage you to look at their websites, because they are doing some innovative things in regard to research and how it affects us as a community.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mrs. Jordan Davis. Dr. Savage Edwards, I want to switch gears and focus a little attention around the barriers to entry as it relates to genetic testing. So please discuss some of the barriers to entry for genetic testing and clinical trials for African Americans.
Some of the barriers, as has been stated already, the biggest one, being medical mistrust. Because of the historical events that have taken place in the past. But even with that, different socioeconomic status, unfortunately, healthcare disparity in healthcare itself. A lot of not just African Americans, but people of color in general just don't have access to healthcare. So by the time they are seeking medical attention, a lot of times their conditions are far greater, far advanced, than say, maybe the Europeans, Caucasians who have preventive care. A lot of times the African Americans in general don't seek that preventive care. And then as was stated before, because of the more prevalent high blood pressure, diabetes, those kinds of things, we're just, we're truly waiting too late almost to seek that care. But the medical mistrust being to me one, because even with my trials that are going on, I do have some African American my trial, but I spend a lot of time trying to dispel the myths going forward, because in the past, that was true. Tuskegee syphilis was real. Henrietta Lacks and cervical cancer, real. African-American boys, real. So I spent a lot of time telling them about, and like Sarah said, the IRB now, and how there's equity in research. And then the other thing, which I'm really just kind of, I remember. So the other thing, one of the barriers is a lot of the participants don't want placebo-controlled studies. They want, and we can understand, because like I said, I am a headache specialist. So if you're having migraines, you want medication. but what they miss is that we want to prove that the medication is better than, say, a sugar pill. And then the other thing that we want to prove is we need to get past the mistrust and know that when different medications are saying, oh, the side effects are dizziness or headaches or what have you, they're not speaking to they're not speaking about African Americans, because people of color were not included in those trials. And as Dr. Cooper stated, in terms of the glomerular filtration rate, the kidneys, that kind of thing, the clearance of the medications, all of that is different when it comes to African Americans. So we are going to have to get past those barriers in order to be included in these studies, and so that the medications can speak to us as well.
That's an excellent point, Dr. Savage Edwards. I want to take a step back if anyone wants to follow up any points regarding that.
Yeah, I will say just from the genetics, part of it has just been research in general to dispel those myths and have people, take the family history seriously for patients of color. So it was just recently that it came out and said, there are the same rates of hereditary cancer, regardless of background. And before, people were saying, well, do we really need to refer them to genetic testing or to genetic counseling? I don't really think there's as higher rates in the African American community. And so it's just been recently that we know that's not true. That you do need to refer, you do need to follow those same processes. And so I think that's kind of a difficulty when we talk about that medical mistrust. There are recent ways in that we're not servicing all communities in the best way possible.
Daryl, if I could just take a step back about the barriers as well. I know one of the things that we do within the Greater Hudson chapter of the Links Incorporated, we have a Weekend Scholars Program. And I know Dr. Cooper mentioned their educational programs as well. And we really try to focus on STEM related careers with those students. And that's one of the ways we will eradicate those barriers. When we have more students in medical school who can get through the pipeline, and then you have those healthcare providers that can service our community, you will then have a level of mistrust that will not be as high as we see today. But we've got to get more minorities through the pipeline. And we can't start when they're in college. We must start when they're in middle school, because that's when you grasp their attention. So we must focus on those middle school students, get them through the pipeline of STEM, so that they can become medical students. Right now, there are less minority males in medical school than in 1968. So we really have a lot of work to do as a community and as a nation to get the underserved populations through medical school and through those MD, PhD programs where they can make a difference.
Absolutely. Let me thank you so much, Mrs. Jordan Davis. Let us switch gears a little bit. And let's talk about the process. Ms. Greaves, if you will, if I test positive for the BRCA1 or BRCA2 genes, how might I improve my health to reduce the impact of cancer?
Yeah, so that's something that, we always want to make sure when we're talking about this test, it is not meant just to scare you and leave you with that, knowing that you're at high risk. It really is there to make sure that you're getting the right screening. If we know about these increased risks for cancers, what are those options to say, okay, prostate exam should start earlier, female relatives are at a higher risk, they can have this test and start mammograms earlier, have those surgery decisions. So that goal overall is really to reduce that cancer burden, to make sure that you are not showing up in 10, 20 years with that late stage disease that's much harder to treat. And as I've already mentioned just in this description, we're talking about genetics, we're talking about families. So it never just impacts one person, it impacts, parents, siblings, children. And that's really the goal too, is to make sure that people are aware and they have that option. Not everyone likes knowing that information, but that they have that option to know their risk.
That's a good point. You mentioned families and making sure that families are, mindful and knowledgeable. There's a question in the chat box as it relates to, is it true that when African Americans want to participate in genetic testing, they are excluded because they often don't have historical family information or family medical history?
That's difficult. We'll talk next time about how information is power is bridging that gap. But a lot of the guidelines, if you don't have a personal history of cancer, do go back to that family history. So that requires knowing both sides of your families, having people who are open to talking about what the cancer diagnoses were and what age they were. And we hear that all the time of people who aren't in contact with their families or were adopted, that they really want a way to know their risk that right now the insurance guidelines don't cover. But that's why information is power is great. And so they can come back in a couple of weeks and kind of hear about how we are trying to make sure that people in the community do have that option.
Dr.
Can I
Cooper.
also say that yes, that is true for information is power, but that should not be a deterrent for all clinical trials, because that's not the end point for all clinical trials, because sometimes we want to know moving forward what to expect from whatever it is that we're testing. So what we typically do in the clinical trials that maybe looking at medication and how medication is going to either be effective or the side effects, that kind of thing. We usually go back about 5 years in terms of the medical records, but it I have some pediatric cases that's going on as well. And so if you don't know your family history, if you are adopted, that still should not be a deterrent for not participating in a clinical trial. I don't want to make it seem that, because remember, the endpoint for each trial is different. Our information is power is looking at the genetics. And so obviously we want to know the historical background, but not all trials are. So, if you don't know your family history, please still participate in a clinical trial.
This is a good point that you're making here, Dr. Savage Edwards. Let me open this question up right here. How does nutrition or environment, in addition to genetics, contribute to disease risk?
Okay, did you want me to answer that?
Please, and then if anyone else wants to jump in on that one, thank you.
Okay, so for me, and especially the different conditions that I treat in terms of, say, multiple sclerosis, which is a good one, when you look at the environment there. So it's not a hereditary disorder, but it is found more in different families, that kind of thing. But the closer you are kind of to the equator, the more, at risk you are for it, that kind of thing. Environment plays a role. Nutrition also plays a role, especially I would say nutrition plays a really large role in the processing, because our standard American diet, which is sad, and the pesticides and all of those things, that go into, it's nice that we are able to grow our food faster and that kind of thing, but there are huge implications when it comes to our health and when it comes to the manifestations of the different disease processes that we are subjected to. And if you really look at it, obesity also is a disease. So the way that food is packaged now, obesity is really a risk factor for high blood pressure, diabetes, stroke, cancer, all of that. So nutrition, we can't get away from it. We cannot. It's hugely important.
Good point. Anybody else want to follow up with that?
I'll just say, yeah, on the hereditary cancer side, it's not that you then ignore diet and environment and all the other things that people tell you to lower your risk of cancer. Most of these are not a 100% cancer risk, so it would still be recommended, follow all those things that your doctors tell you, have a healthy weight, have a healthy diet, to make sure that, or try and make sure that you're one of the 20% with those genes that never develops a cancer.
All right, as we bring our discussion to a close, I would like to get closing thoughts from the roundtable this evening. Dr. Cooper.
This has been a fabulous discussion. I have really enjoyed hearing everybody's perspectives. And I think the main message I would like you to leave with is that genetic testing in general offers individuals an opportunity to learn information about their risk for disease, and that information has the potential to improve their health outcomes going forward. And we talked a lot today about how access to that information in the African American community in particular has been not as good as it should be, and certainly not equivalent to their Caucasian and European descent counterparts. And so I invite you to join us next time to hear more about the Information is Power program, which really is aimed at offering genetic testing for inherited cancer risk broadly throughout our community. And we hope that you'll come to hear more about it and consider participating in the program.
Thank you. Mrs. Jordan Davis.
Once again, I'd like to say that we need to be actively engaged in our healthcare. We want to partner with organizations who have a vested interest in our communities. I know working with HudsonAlpha recently, they are trying to make strides within the Huntsville community to make sure that there's access and equity within healthcare research. So I always say, if you don't see something, go to the source and ask to be included. So access equals equity, but you also have to be actively engaged.
Ms. Agree?
Yeah, I think just to echo Ms. Jordan Davis, to really be advocates for your own healthcare. And part of that involves educating and knowing what to ask for. And that's true in genetics, that's true in all areas of medicine. So, we would hope that, especially next time, I'll kind of go over some of those things, that if a test is not being offered to you or it's not being discussed, to make sure that you are asking for that information.
Thank you. Dr. Savage Edwards.
Yes, I also agree with my fellow panelists that we should be proactive because now that we are aware of the clinical trials that are going on, if they are not offered by your primary care physician, ask, because the clinical trials are great. There are clinical trials in terms of diabetes. There are clinical trials in terms of headache, whatever condition, Parkinson's. I just sent a patient over to UAH just today because there's a Parkinson's study. And the great thing about these clinical trials is that they are compensated. So you you're probably a good meal and gas and that kind of thing. So that's a good thing. And just to know that you are you're helping not only yourself, but the future generation as well. So I just encourage everyone, please seek out a clinical trial and participate in it.
Thank you. And Ms. Butler.
Thank you. And I would just ditto everything that's been said this evening. And I would like to thank the panelists. And I hope the listeners will take advantage of the information that's been presented to them tonight, and the opportunities that will be offered coming forth. And as they indicated, any trials, please take advantage of it because it will help the African American community.
Thank you. Well, it's our hope that tonight's conversation will be a resource for you and your family. I would like to thank all of our guests tonight, our roundtable guests, the audience Hudson Alpha, and the greater Huntsville chapter of the Links Incorporated. Before we go, we ask that you participate in a very, very short poll that will help us to learn a little bit more about tonight's event and plan for future events. So you'll be receiving that poll in just a second. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us.